tag team here with Mark, so Mark.
All right, thank you, T. Yeah, so one of the things that I got in the agenda last night that I had 20 minutes, or actually about 10 minutes, to describe the entire education system in Oregon and what are we doing in terms of our investment strategies to shift that education system. So here we go, strap on. No, actually, I get the very great privilege of working with very powerful educators who are really doing the right thing on the ground, both in and out of school, not just in K-12, but in our post-secondary institutions as well, and then also working with the STEM Investment Council and other industry partners to really think differently about how we're envisioning and transforming our educational systems so that sort of the supply and demand on one hand, where we're looking at, what do we need as a state in terms of the talent needs to drive an inclusive innovation economy, so that it's not just about filling jobs, but it's also about creating jobs. And it's not just about jobs, but it's more broadly the purpose of education to develop the skills, talents, dispositions for individuals to contribute their talents to transform society, to create healthy communities. So that's a real big-ass goal, if you will, a big BHAG, very audacious goal. Can I say that? Can I swear here? So, it's Saturday, I've got my hat off. I'll get detention, that's right. That's right. But I've worked in and out of the education system in a number of different capacities, and so I'm bringing in a lot of different perspectives to this work. And when we think about the enormous complexities of the education system, it's been extremely resilient to change. Right? I mean, I think that is a very simplified expression. We've spent billions and billions and billions of dollars to try to transform the educational practices in the community, or in the classrooms, and within the structures of the educational system as a whole. And it's a major challenge. And what we have to do is ask ourselves and challenge some of the fundamental assumptions upon which those cultures become self-reinforcing. And so I love what Dr. Sutherland said about being willing to ask questions that seem perhaps overly simplified, but when you delve into what does a null bus mean, in principle, and are you articulating that? Those are the kinds of questions that the STEM Investment Council is raising as well. How do we think about the structures of the school day? How do we think about where and how education needs to occur? And so from a philosophical principle, if you will, behind this work of STEM and career and technical education is the notion that education is a collective responsibility. Education is the single most important thing that we do as a society in any culture around the globe. And so it doesn't just take place in our formal education system. In fact, only 18.5% of a K-12 student's waking hours are spent in a classroom. When we think about our own individual twisty paths that got us to where we are today, they were impacted by individuals certainly in classrooms. But think about those individuals beyond the classroom that shaped your trajectory, whether those were parents or grandparents or church youth group leaders or 4-H experiences, whether it was trips to OMSI or playing in a mud puddle or exploring the tide pools on the coast. Those are the kinds of experiences that shape our lives. And it's the questions and the curiosity, perhaps, that drives self-directed learners more than anything else. And so I like to throw out to this group my definition of STEM, because far too often we start encapsulating STEM as being about subject areas. Just like science is not about the right answer as fast as possible. No, it's about our own ignorance. and ignorance truly drives the scientific endeavors. So my definition of STEM is actually applied curiosity. It's that insatiable desire to know, which you get that science piece, with a desire to create, to bring something new, a perspective into the world, or build something tangible, or to solve problems worth solving. So our strategy when we look at a very complex culture that's reinforced, we draw upon one particular metaphor, and that is of an ecosystem. You know, how do ecosystems transform? How do cultures transform? How do new ideas get formulated? Where do they come from? And we know that there's another principle that drives that work, and that is that diversity drives innovation. A diversity in an ecosystem drives innovation. Diversity in cultures drives innovation. Diversities in content areas drive innovation. Carver Mead at Caltech. I took a course just after you left, actually, there, that you might have actually designed with Carver. You know, he moved from computing science into computational physiks and biology, and started to see how that intersection of different fields evolved his thinking and drove those new ideas. That's happening over and over and over again. So in education, as a fundamental investment strategy that we're taking, is how do we encourage more diversity of thinking and diversity of cultures in our education system? And not just from the equity perspective, which is critical, because far too few of our students of color and our students facing poverty have access to those high-wage, high-demand jobs and career trajectories for a number of different reasons, but there's institutional biases against there that we need to address, number one. But also from the industry perspective is how do we get new ideas? And driving more women and students of color into these fields are going to create different questions that need to be asked and different ways of thinking about the challenges. And it'll shift the mindsets and the paradigms. So one of the biggest things that we're trying to do at regional levels is to encourage this mashup of K-12, post-secondary, out-of-school time providers, industry leaders, workforce, economic development, civic leaders around these regional STEM hubs, to take a look at their community and say, what are our needs here? What are the talents and assets that we already have? How can we leverage that? And move conversations beyond just the financial conversations that we tend to spiral into, but saying, how do we leverage our intellectual assets, our human assets, our retirees, so that we can actually transform the educational experiences for individuals and thus move the system beyond that self-reinforcing swirl. So how do we blur the lines between community and classroom, and where and how does education take place? So that's a major thrust of it, and we've got 11 different STEM hubs in the state that are doing this really hard work, and you'll hear from Jill in a minute about how the South Metro Salem STEM Hub is bringing together business and industry with educators to truly transform experiences for the educators and the students. But then the question from a systems perspective, we have to think about, well, that's just then isolating pockets of excellence here. How do we transform the system? We're program rich and systems core, and unfortunately a lot of some of our legislative friends with short timeline start thinking about if-then in this linear fashion rather than kind of emergence, and the tolerance to sustain kind of these messier approaches that I believe are actually going to lead to the change is a challenge in of itself, because we don't want to oversimplify the message, right? So then as a state, how do we get this cross-pollination from these pockets of excellence so that ideas and information flows and that gets gets taken up in a more systems fashion, so that the rate of information exchange becomes accelerated. And so then you start asking, well, what's the connective tissue that needs to happen across these regions in order for that information to get exchanged. And Oregon Computer Science Teachers Association is one of those professional networks where information can flow and link these regional efforts so that we as a whole state can be lifted up. There's other efforts like that, but we believe very strongly, as I said, not all STEM is created equal. And so the STEM Investment Council chose to invest in really focusing on digital literacy for the entire state, computer science, coding with a purpose, not just coding and admiring the tool of code, but actually challenging individuals to use that tool to solve problems and to also then develop their thinking skills. So I want to ask Jill to come up and talk about this notion and this power of bringing industry volunteers together with educators to truly transform the system in a bigger way.